Welcome to your favorite horror podcast show, The Midnight Alarm. Today, we have many real stories that our moderator has collected for you. Hope you will enjoy our stories. Without any further delay, let's move on to our first story. I am reading it exactly as it was written. In 2022, my brother Michael was well known as a successful businessman in a local market in Austin, Texas. Over time, his business grew, and so did his wealth. Everything was going well. Michael had 2 children, the younger one named Ethan and the elder one named Ryan. His family also included his wife, parents, and his younger brother with his wife. However, due to some familial issues, the younger brother lived separately with his wife. One day, Ryan went to school as usual. Michael was at the market, and Ethan was watching TV in the afternoon while his mother cooked. Ethan was watching TV in a room on the 2nd floor. While watching, he noticed something strange outside the window. He called out to his father to lower the TV volume as he wanted to pray. Confused, Ethan soon realized that no one else was home except him. His grandfather was in the backyard, and his grandmother was helping his mother. No one usually entered Ethan's room. He went downstairs, crying to his mother, but being young, no one believed him. Michael returned from the market around 7 or 8 p.m., had dinner with his family, and went to sleep. That night, Michael had a nightmare where a dark, menacing figure threatened him, saying, "I have come to end you." Michael woke up frightened but dismissed it as a bad dream. A few days later, Michael started feeling unwell whenever he sat in his shop. He felt extreme discomfort and pain, forcing him to close the shop and return home. His wife noticed his pale appearance and asked if he was okay. Michael brushed it off, saying he just didn't feel well. Despite being a hard-working man who never closed his shop, Michael's health continued to deteriorate. His family took him to a doctor, who found nothing physically wrong and suggested rest, attributing his condition to stress or overwork. However, even after resting, Michael's condition worsened. His face became pale, his eyes sunken, and he seemed to be losing strength daily. He could barely speak or interact with anyone, often sitting alone, staring into the sky. His family grew increasingly worried as his business suffered, and his health declined rapidly. One day, after attending church, the pastor noticed Michael's deteriorating condition and asked if something was wrong. Michael shared his nightmare and the strange occurrences at home. The pastor suspected that Michael might be under the influence of dark forces and advised him to seek help from a knowledgeable spiritual advisor immediately. Michael and his father began searching for a reputable spiritual advisor but found no immediate relief. Meanwhile, Michael's health continued to decline. After 21 days, they finally found a spiritual advisor who visited their home. Upon entering, the advisor sensed a dark presence in the house. After investigating, he confirmed that Michael was a victim of dark magic aimed at destroying his business and health. The advisor performed a ritual to break the dark magic, using candles, incense, and other materials. He revealed that the dark magic was cast by someone close to the family, likely out of jealousy. The advisor warned that if the person responsible did not seek forgiveness, the powerful spirit used in the spell would turn against them. The advisor destroyed the dark magic and gave Michael a protective charm, instructing him to follow specific rituals for 25 days. He also advised Michael to avoid accepting food or drinks from outsiders during this period. As the days passed, Michael's health gradually improved. However, his younger brother's wife, who had cast the spell out of jealousy, began experiencing strange and terrifying occurrences. She confessed her actions on the 23rd night and sought forgiveness. The advisor provided her with a protective charm and strict instructions to follow until the 25th day. By the end of the 25 days, Michael had fully recovered, and the disturbances in the house ceased. The advisor emphasized that dark magic not only brings suffering in this world but also severe consequences in the afterlife. The family learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of envy and the importance of seeking divine protection. That was our first story. We have many more stories today, and at the end, we have a special story, so make sure to listen to the full episode. Before I start reading the next story, I request you to subscribe to this channel. It will motivate me to collect more and more new stories for you. Now, I'm going to read the next story. This is an incident that happened 5 to 6 years ago involving one of our neighbors, who is like a grandfather to me. The incident primarily involved him. My grandfather's house used to store grain for all 12 months of the year, so he often had to go to the grain mill to get it processed. The mill was located in a place called Willow Creek, which was a small rural town. One evening, my grandfather took some grain to the mill to get it processed. By the time the work was done, it was already dusk, and darkness had fallen all around. Let me mention that it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to walk from Willow Creek to our house. Since it was evening, no taxis or rides were willing to come, so my grandfather had no choice but to carry the sack of grain on his back and start walking home. After walking for about 5 minutes along the main road, he took a dirt path that led toward our neighborhood. Let me describe the path a bit. After leaving the main road, the dirt path cut through the woods, crossed a set of old railroad tracks, and then merged with another paved road in an area called Pine Hollow to the east. At the beginning of the path, there weren't many houses around, though some were located a bit further away. This particular stretch of the road had a reputation for being haunted. Many people had reported seeing strange things there at night. On both sides of the road stood two large oak trees. At that time, my grandfather didn't have any flashlight with him, but the moonlight made everything around him visible. As he walked near the two oak trees, he heard a rustling sound and suddenly stopped. The sound was like dry leaves rubbing against each other in a strong wind, even though there was no wind at all at that moment. My grandfather immediately realized that the sound wasn't natural. He looked toward the oak trees and noticed something moving among the dry leaves at the top of the trees. He dismissed it, thinking it might be some animal, and continued walking. But just as he was about to pass the trees, he saw something he was completely unprepared for. He saw two human-like heads, shaped like human heads, fall from the two oak trees right into the middle of the road. After falling, they started rolling around. In the moonlight, my grandfather could clearly see that these were two severed human heads, and they were staring at him while continuously laughing. My grandfather was frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. He stood there, staring at the heads as if they had paralyzed him. After a while, the heads began to float slightly above the ground, rolling and moving into the nearby woods. My grandfather watched in shock as they disappeared from sight. Though he was a brave man, this sight left him shaken. He decided to quickly walk away from the area, but little did he know that the ultimate horror was still waiting for him. As he walked a bit further, he saw something white lying on the road. Yes, it was a dead body, stretched out across the road, blocking his path. There was no way to go around it. Seeing this, my grandfather became even more terrified. Overwhelmed with fear, he closed his eyes and started reciting prayers. The sack of grain was still on his back. He couldn't tell how long he stood there with his eyes closed, but when he finally opened them, the road was completely empty. It was as if nothing had happened just moments ago. My grandfather looked around but saw nothing unusual. He quickly resumed walking, reciting prayers the entire way home. Much later, one evening, we were all sitting together, sharing ghost stories, when my grandfather decided to share this terrifying incident from his life with us. So, that was our second story today. Though the story was short, it was very interesting. Just imagine yourself on an empty road at night, with a human-like head laughing near you, or imagine what if a dead body came to you right now while you're hearing this story. Only those who have faced such incidents can truly understand. Now, let's move on to the next story. I am reading it exactly as it was written.
Hey, where are you going? Are you feeling scared? We'll make you feel even scarier. Stay with the Midnight Alarm.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us experienced disrupted sleep schedules, and I was no exception. There were nights when I couldn't sleep at all, or I'd fall asleep at odd hours, sometimes at 1 a.m., sometimes at 2 a.m., or even 3 a.m. It was a chaotic time. One night, I noticed something unusual. But before I get into that, let me give you some context. Our house has a narrow alley in front, a small passageway that's just wide enough for one person to walk through. It's not exactly a road, more like a gap between houses. My window faces this alley. One night, around 2 or 3 a.m., I was listening to music with my earphones on when I started hearing a rustling sound. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. But then I noticed the sound kept repeating, rustling, then silence, then rustling again. Curious, I took off my earphones to listen more carefully. The sound was coming from the alley, where dry leaves were scattered on the ground. It sounded like someone was walking on those leaves. But that didn't make sense because, at that hour, no one should be there. Normally, cats or raccoons from the neighboring houses might wander through, and sometimes people would come during the day to collect leaves for composting, but at night, it was unusual. Still, I didn't think much of it and went back to listening to music. However, the sound didn't stop. It was as if someone was walking from one end of the alley to the other, back and forth, over and over. I thought, if it's a cat or a raccoon, why would it keep walking up and down like that? But since I was used to such noises, I didn't dwell on it too much. I decided to open the window and look outside. I turned on my phone's flashlight and tried to see what was causing the sound, but I couldn't see anything. Frustrated, I thought, whatever, it's not worth worrying about, and decided to close the window. Our window isn't made of glass, it's a metal shutter that you have to pull down to close. As I reached out to close it, something grabbed my hand. It was a human hand, dark, as if covered in ash, with no nails or hair. I was terrified. I screamed and fainted on the spot. The next morning, I woke up in my bed. My mom came in and asked, "What happened last night? Why did you scream?" "We found you unconscious." I told her everything about the sound, the hand, and how scared I was. She said she hadn't heard any sound that night. But then she mentioned something strange. She said that every night, around 2 or 30 a.m., a strong smell of burnt wood and sulfur would fill their room. Both she and my dad could smell it, but they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. This whole incident left me shaken. I've always been fascinated by ghost stories and paranormal experiences, but I'm not exactly brave. I've grown up listening to stories about ghosts and spirits from my mom, grandma, and aunts. I've always wanted to see something supernatural, but when it actually happened, I was terrified. The incident left me shaken, but as the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about the hand I had felt and the strange sounds in the alley. I decided to confront my fear, not by ignoring it, but by trying to understand it. I began researching the history of our neighborhood, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened. One afternoon, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article in the local library's archives. It told the story of a fire that had occurred decades ago in our neighborhood. A small house had once stood where the alley now was, and tragically, a young man had lost his life trying to save his family from the flames. The article mentioned that he had been known for his kindness and his love of music, often playing the guitar late into the night. The fire had been devastating, and the alley was built over the ruins of the house. Reading this, I felt a deep sense of sadness. The rustling sound, the burnt smell, the hand, it all started to make sense. It wasn't something malevolent. It was a spirit trapped in a moment of tragedy, perhaps longing for peace. I decided to do something to honor his memory. I will share those things another time. Stay blessed. Long live the Midnight Alarm. So that was the story. I hope my listeners enjoyed it. Without any delay, I am going to read the next story.
Hey, where are you going? Are you feeling scared? We'll make you feel even scarier. Stay with the Midnight Alarm.
My name is Daniel Mercer. My hometown is in Louisiana, but I am currently in New York. I have been interested in paranormal stories for about 7 to 8 years. I didn't know how to share an incident before, but the biggest problem is that I am not very good at writing. However, I thought I could at least try. The incident I'm about to share happened to a cab driver. I will narrate it from the very beginning, exactly as I saw it. This incident took place at a church gathering at my maternal grandmother's house. The gathering was held in the name of my mother's grandfather, who was a well-known pastor. I don't know if you have heard of him, but his name was Reverend Thomas Whitaker. The church holds this service every year in his honor. Like every year, we attended the gathering. On the afternoon of the service, my mother, my younger sister, and I set out for my grandmother's house. Our house is not far from my grandmother's place. It takes about 20 minutes on foot and 8 to 10 minutes by taxi. Just before leaving, my mother reminded me to wear warm clothes because of the cold weather. So, I went back inside and grabbed my winter jacket. As soon as we got on the road, we found a cab. I asked the driver if he was going to our destination, and he said yes. We got in, and as the vehicle started moving, the driver suddenly asked, "Are you going to the church gathering?" My mother replied, "Yes, we are going to the service and my father's house." We chatted with the driver on the way, and before we knew it, we had arrived at my grandmother's house. The driver dropped us off and got back in his car. Just as he was about to start the engine, he muttered, "It's so dark. Even the headlights aren't working properly. How am I going to drive like this?" Then, he drove off. Later, I talked to my cousins about when they planned to go to the gathering. I wanted to go immediately, but they insisted that we all go together because I might get scared if I went alone. The church was only a 5 to 6 minute walk from my grandmother's house, but along the way, there was a stretch of thick woods. The largest part of it belonged to my grandfather, and there were many spooky stories associated with it, stories that I will share another time. Around 9 p.m., we were on our way to the church when we saw a dead cat lying in the middle of the road. My cousin remarked, "Who could have killed it on the day of the service?" We walked past it, but when I shone my flashlight back at the spot, the road was completely clear. There was no cat at all. My cousin said, "This road isn't good. Sometimes, strange things happen here. I've seen odd things before." As we continued walking, we heard dogs barking from inside the woods. Fear gripped everyone, especially one woman in our group, who started praying as she hurried past the spot. A little further ahead, we saw a familiar cab driver. He recognized me because we often traveled in his taxi. He asked, "How are you, kid?" I replied, "I'm fine, sir. How are you?" He said, "Thank the Lord, I'm doing well." Then he asked about my mother, and after a brief exchange, he went on his way, and so did we. After wandering around a bit, I finally sat down in the church tent. By then, the gathering was nearing its conclusion, and the final prayers were beginning. During the prayers, I noticed that the cab driver was sitting behind me, crying, with tears falling onto his coat. At the end of the service, food packets were distributed. When they handed him one packet, he asked for another, and they gave him an extra one. Later that night, around 3 a.m., I heard dogs howling eerily. I fell asleep despite the unsettling sound. The next morning, my mother woke me up for breakfast. While I was eating, my elder uncle's third son suddenly came in and said, "That cab driver was found dead. His body is lying under an old oak tree inside the woods, exactly in the posture of someone kneeling in prayer." At first, no one believed it because my cousin was known for making mischief. But then, the whole town started running towards the scene. People were saying, "Who could have killed such a simple, kind-hearted man? He was known to be an honest and good person. Who could possibly have had such hatred for him?" The police arrived and were so shaken by the sight that they decided not to take the body for a post-mortem due to requests from the town's mayor and other elders. Then, the elders of the town began discussing stories about the old church grounds. They said that there was a pond where Reverend Whitaker used to perform baptisms and that he had both benevolent and malevolent spirits watching over the land. The good spirits would protect the church, while the darker ones were harder to control. Everyone soon came to the conclusion that this was no ordinary death, that was the work of spirits. Some said he must have encountered them on his way back from the church, while others speculated that he had unknowingly disturbed them when he stopped in the woods. I still couldn't fully believe it, so I asked my grandfather's brother, who was over 110 years old, "Grandpa, are there really spirits here?" He replied, "There are many spirits here. Most of them are good, but a few are very dangerous. One of them must have attacked him." After that incident, the townspeople stopped using that road at night. Later, they decided to build a small chapel at the spot where the incident occurred. When the construction was complete, the townspeople wanted to install electric lights there. Since candles wouldn't stay lit due to the wind, they applied for an electricity meter. But before it arrived, they decided to draw power from the main line using two cables. As soon as they connected one cable and tried to attach the second one, there was a loud explosion. My uncle, who was handling the wiring, collapsed into a nearby ditch and started convulsing like a fish out of water. After 3 or 4 violent jerks, he stopped moving. He was rushed to the hospital, but the doctors declared him dead. When his body was brought back home, the entire town was filled with cries of grief and fear. People were too terrified to speak. In the end, everyone kept saying the same thing: the spirits did not want lights there. They did not like the intrusion. This was my first story. If it gets selected, Please let me know. I know my writing is not very good, and I wrote this with great difficulty while on duty. If there are any mistakes, please forgive me. Thank you so much, Daniel Mercer, for providing such an interesting story. I hope all my listeners enjoyed it. I will move on to the next story, but before that, I request you to subscribe to this channel and comment below how you liked this story. Also, let us know what type of stories you enjoy, and our team will try to find similar ones for you. Now, I am reading the next story. It was around mid-January 2020 when my brother-in-law and I were sitting and watching a football game. It was about 12 a.m. when we got a call from his house. The phone call informed us that his uncle had passed away, and we were asked to come to the house. Even though my brother-in-law's uncle had no children, my brother-in-law was the only son in the house. Anyway, we both set off. It's worth noting that my brother-in-law's house was about 6 to 8 miles from ours, and we were walking down a rural road. We couldn't find any vehicle, so we kept walking. When we reached the downtown area, we saw a battery-powered scooter approaching from a distance. We signaled the driver to stop. The driver's appearance was unusual. He was over 50 years old, had a full beard, and wore heavy clothes. We asked him if he could take us to a nearby town, and he said he was heading home and couldn't go since it was already late. He suggested we find another ride. We then explained that it was urgent since our uncle had passed away and offered to pay more if he could help. At that moment, he said, "Don't mention that your uncle has passed away, just get in quickly." So, we got into the scooter and began our journey. We were traveling at high speed down a deserted road. After a while, a pleasant fragrance filled the air, similar to perfume. We asked the driver if he was wearing perfume, but he didn't respond. We asked a few more times, but still no reply. A few minutes later, he spoke, saying, "Please, pray more. The road ahead is not safe." Without fully understanding, we started praying. After the prayers, we asked him what had happened at that location, but he didn't answer. After 45 minutes, we finally reached my brother-in-law's house. When we arrived, my brother-in-law told me to leave and return by scooter in the morning. By then, it was about 2 a.m. After dropping him off, I began my journey home. On the way, I tried talking to the driver, but he didn't say anything. When I passed the same spot again, I smelled the same fragrance. I asked if he could smell it, but he said nothing, only repeating, "Pray, keep praying." I prayed again, though this time I was even more scared because my brother wasn't with me. About an hour later, I reached home, got off the scooter, and tried to pay the driver. However, he refused to take the money. Even after I insisted, he wouldn't take it. Finally, he said, "What would I do with this money?" I was surprised and asked, "You drive this scooter to earn money, don't you?" He smiled and said, "I don't need money." Then he left. The next day, I shared the experience with my brother. He asked if I remembered the man's name and address. I said yes. We went to the address and asked locals about the man's house. They pointed us to a house. We entered and greeted the people inside. A woman came out and said she didn't recognize us. We introduced ourselves, told her we were from a nearby town, and asked if it was the house of the man we mentioned. She confirmed it and said he had passed away last month. We were stunned. I asked if there was a photo of him, and the woman showed us one. When I saw the photo, I couldn't believe my eyes. This man had traveled with us for 2 hours just 2 days ago, yet he had passed away months ago. At that moment, I noticed the scooter in the yard. It was the same one that had taken us to my brother-in-law's house. Both my brother and I stared at each other in disbelief. How could this be possible? Without saying anything more, we handed the woman some money and left, still in shock. We couldn't explain it. That was my story. May God bless you all. Long live the Midnight Alarm. Thank you so much for the story. Dear listener, what would your reaction be if you ever heard something like this? You spent time with someone. Then later you find out that person had already died a month ago. I don't know. Now, let's move to the next story. It was around 2007 or 2008 when I, Sarah, and my family went to stay at my Uncle John's house. After spending some time there, we suddenly found out that people were discussing the idea of me marrying my cousin, Tyler. A few days later, one evening, I sat down to think about it. We were all there, and after a while of talking, I set a condition. If they wanted me to marry, I couldn't stay in the small town and would need to move to the city. But my Aunt Karen refused, and there was an argument between us. Eventually, I told them I wouldn't marry. After saying that, I left the room in frustration and went to sit in the tool shed. The shed was just 2 rooms away. The house was surrounded by vast fields, and there was a 100-year-old oak tree at the front of the house. People always whispered about strange things happening around the tree. It was said that sometimes it appeared upside down at night, and other times, it would mysteriously disappear. To set the scene, there was a wooden bench in the tool shed. I turned on the light and sat on the bench with my legs dangling down. I was scrolling through my phone. After about 10 to 15 minutes, something terrifying happened. Suddenly, I felt a firm grip on both my feet from behind. Before I could even look down, I felt a sharp pull from the front. When I looked forward, what I saw left me completely stunned. In the dim light, I saw a vague figure standing before me, holding a thick chain. The figure was about 7 or 8 feet tall, but I couldn't make out its face or eyes. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I had heard many ghost stories, but never had I encountered something like this before. The figure was cloaked in black, and although I wasn't sure, it seemed to be wearing a long, dark robe. I couldn't fully grasp its shape, but it was holding the chain that had gripped my feet. In that moment, I couldn't move. My body was stiff, and I had no strength to fight back. The figure gave another sharp pull, and I nearly fell off the bench. The pain was unbearable. Terrified, I couldn't speak, but I managed to scream loudly, and everyone came rushing in. But my Aunt Karen didn't show up. I was too scared to talk, so I just pointed to the direction where I had seen the figure. But by the time they arrived, it had disappeared. After a little while, when I had calmed down, I told them everything. At first, they didn't believe me, but when they saw the marks on my feet from the chain, they believed me. There were dark marks that stayed for many years. My cousin Tyler interrupted me, and then my older sister, Emily, started speaking. She said, "Sarah, the night before, Aunt Karen asked me to sleep with her. Even though I didn't want to, she insisted because she was my step-aunt, and I couldn't refuse. Everyone else had already gone to sleep, and I ended up lying next to her. In the middle of the night, I woke up and realized that Grandma wasn't beside me. I looked around the room, and my eyes went down. I saw someone in a white gown sitting on the floor, holding a clay tray with a lit candle. The person wasn't facing me but was turned to the side. I stared at them for a long time but couldn't figure out who it was. I thought it might be Grandma. I was about to get up and check, but then I stopped myself because I had heard that disturbing such things could bring terrible consequences. So, I just closed my eyes and pretended to sleep." Emily continued, "Yes, that was Grandma. I had seen her too. Many years ago, I had slept in the same room with her, and in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of someone speaking softly. I saw her sitting by the candle, wearing a white gown, talking to someone. But I knew what was going on, so I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. Then Aunt Karen explained that there was a reason for her strange behavior. She said that she had several spirits around her, and one of them needed to be appeased. If not, it would cause harm. She didn't want to reveal the name of the spirit, but I had heard her call it Mona. After this, Tyler and several others went to check the old oak tree. Following Aunt Karen's instructions, they found 11 nails stuck into the tree and removed them, confirming everything Aunt Karen had said. Thank you for letting me share this story in my own way. I hope you were able to understand it clearly. If anything was confusing, I apologize. Thank you also for sending your story. Dear listener, if you have any paranormal story, comment below. Our team will contact you to collect your story. Don't skip the episode, make sure you listen to the whole episode, as we have a special story at the end. Now I am going to read the next story. I will read the story as it is. This incident was told to me by my mother. She was very young at the time, around 7 or 8 years old. To the east of their house, there was a large, abandoned piece of land, mostly surrounded by dense forest. Once, a Hindu family decided to build a house on that land. Since the land was abandoned, they were able to purchase it at a very low price, and they quickly began constructing the house. When the house was nearly half completed, they decided to build a bathroom to the north of the house. As usual, they dug the ground and first created a large pit, and then began the bathroom construction. During the work, the head of the family had a strange dream one night. In the dream, he saw the workers had completed half of the bathroom work. By the time it was evening, everyone was heading home for the day. After paying the workers, he entered his house. But just as he was entering, he heard a strange voice calling from behind. When he turned around, no one was there. Moments later, the same voice spoke again. "You will build a bathroom here, but we will be next." He had this same dream for several nights, where an invisible voice kept repeating these words to him. At first, he didn't pay much attention, but soon he began to feel uneasy, thinking that something might be wrong. Meanwhile, the bathroom work was nearing completion, and a cement lid was placed over the large pit that had been left open. Then, one day, something unusual happened. One of their sons-in-law came to visit to see the new house. The relationship between the son-in-law and the brother-in-law was very friendly, with both always joking and laughing together. That day, they made a bet with each other. Whoever could stay in the pit for 10 minutes, with the lid closed, would be rewarded. It is important to note that the head of the family was not at home at the time. He had gone to the market, and he didn't know about the bet. Despite other family members protesting against the bet, it went ahead. The son-in-law went first, and the pit lid was closed over him. It was decided that if either of them felt they couldn't stay any longer, they could pull on the rope tied to their waist to signal to be pulled out. The tense moment passed, and just minutes later, the head of the family returned home from the market. When he saw a large crowd near the pit, he hurried inside and asked what was going on. Upon hearing about the bet, he immediately rushed over, lifted the cement lid, and looked into the pit. To his horror, he saw his son-in-law, wearing a white lungi, lying unconscious at the bottom of the pit. He called out to him several times, but there was no response. He quickly instructed a nearby boy to pull him out, and after much effort, they pulled him to the surface. But by then, he was already dead. The strangest and most terrifying part of this incident was the clear 5-finger imprint on his neck. No one had entered the pit to strangle him, so how did this happen? The mystery of this strange death remains unsolved to this day. The story was really horrible. Dear listener, please comment below if you've ever experienced something like this. Also, I request you never make fun of paranormal activities. Let's move to the next story. I am speaking from the USA, from Chicago, and this is an incident that happened to me in Chicago. The incident took place between 2006 and 2010, and after that, I didn't want to experiment or mess around with it anymore, which you will understand later. So, towards the end of 2006, in October, I had just started my professional life in the USA. I had 2 small children and a wife at the time, and occasionally I had to do night shifts. My workplace was near the intersection of Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue in Chicago. Wacker Drive is on the north side, running east-west, and Michigan Avenue runs north-south. My workplace was near the intersection of Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue, and it was in a bustling city area. The bus stop for the area was where the incident took place. The first night I had to work the night shift, it was around 10:30 or 11 p.m. I was driving from the south to the north on Michigan Avenue. As I entered the city center, it was about 5 minutes to my workplace. In October, the weather was a bit chilly, even though it wasn't fully winter yet. The temperature at night was about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and if there was a breeze, it felt even colder. As I drove into the city area, I was going at almost 40 miles per hour when I saw a woman sitting on the bench at the bus stop. She was wearing a long skirt, made of cotton or linen, and a white shirt. She turned her head from the right to the left and stared straight at me, even though I was driving at full speed. She gave me a small smile, as if anticipating my arrival, or that some vehicle would pass by. This all happened within 5 seconds, and the whole scene struck me as very odd. First of all, it was a quiet area, and this was a city zone surrounded by large buildings. It was an eerie quietness. Why would a woman be sitting at a bus stop at such a late hour? And not only that, but it was 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and she was wearing summer clothes, sitting there without any signs of being affected by the cold weather, as if it were a warm summer day. The whole scene felt very strange and unnatural to me. I didn't think much of it that night and just went to work. 4 to 5 months later, it was 2007, the cold weather was slowly turning into spring. However, The night temperatures were still around 15 degrees Fahrenheit to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. One evening, my wife and I went for a long drive. After wandering around aimlessly for a bit, I suddenly remembered the strange incident from months ago. I hadn't told my wife about it before, but I decided to take her to that spot. It took about 40 to 45 minutes to drive there, and the temperature that night was around 15 degrees Fahrenheit to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was just past 11 p.m. By the time we reached the spot, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The same woman, wearing the same clothes, was sitting on the same bench, in the same position, turning her head from right to left, as if expecting me. I knew something was definitely wrong, something beyond normal, possibly paranormal. I didn't tell my wife what I had seen. Afterward, my workplace changed, and for years passed. In June 2010, my wife and kids were in the Philippines, and I hadn't taken a break yet. It was a long weekend, and I didn't have work the next day, so I decided to go on another long drive. As I was driving, I made up my mind that I would visit that place again after 4 years and see if anything unusual happened there. I reached the spot around 11:30 p.m. or just before midnight. Believe it or not, the same thing happened again. The same woman, or whatever entity she was sitting on the same bench, wearing the same clothes, looking in the same direction, relaxed, and expecting someone. I was certain at that moment that something out of this world was going on. This was not a normal occurrence. I had seen this twice before, 4 years ago, and here I was, seeing it a third time. After this, I decided I would never investigate or think about it again. I wanted to share this with everyone, so I am telling you now. Let me know how it feels. Thank you for sharing the story. We may find this story short and normal, but those who have faced any unusual things or paranormal activities are the only ones who can realize how it feels. I am going to read the next story. We used to live in the city, but we had a house in the countryside, so we would frequently visit our family property. When we went to the countryside, I had a hobby of fishing. So whenever I went there with my cousin, we would go fishing together. One afternoon, we decided to check the river and set up our fishing nets. The spot where we set the nets was by a large pond near a wooded area, which we called Hollow Creek. That night, my cousin and I decided to go back and check if any big fish had been caught. After a quick discussion, we grabbed a small boat and made our way to Hollow Creek, which was about a mile away from the house. It was a bit of a journey. As we were about halfway there, we noticed that our boat wasn't moving forward anymore. It felt like something was caught underneath. We thought it could be some water plants or a branch blocking the boat, so we tried pushing it with a paddle, but it wouldn't budge. Then I decided to reach under the boat with my hand to see what was stuck. When I did, it felt like some thin wooden object. I tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't move, so I grabbed a nearby stick and pulled harder. What we saw next completely stunned us. We found a human skeleton. I couldn't believe it. We immediately became terrified and wondered how a human skeleton ended up at Hollow Creek. We panicked and decided to push it aside. After that, we were too scared to check the nets, which were a little farther ahead. I told my cousin to hurry and get the boat back to the house, and we would check the nets the next morning. As we tried to move the boat back, we once again felt something strange beneath it. We tried to push forward with the paddle, but the boat wouldn't budge. This time, I checked again with the stick and found something blocking the way. When I looked closer, I realized it was another human skeleton. We were completely unprepared for this. At that moment, we became certain that this was something beyond natural explanation. We moved the second skeleton aside and tried to row the boat faster back to the house. But then, something even stranger happened. No matter how hard we rowed, the boat started moving backward instead of forward. In fear, we decided to keep the stick in place to hold the boat steady. We couldn't control it anymore, and my cousin passed out from fear. I was left alone, panicking and not knowing what to do. We didn't have any phones with us, just a flashlight, because we had left our phones at home to charge. We couldn't call anyone for help. As the first light of morning broke and the sun began to rise, the boat finally stopped spinning. I sighed in relief and gave my cousin some water, and he regained consciousness. Still shaken from the experience, I told him to hurry back home. I didn't want to stress him out further, so I took control of the boat. When we reached home, we told everyone about what had happened. They said the area we had gone to was known for strange and unexplainable occurrences, and similar incidents had happened in the past. That was the story. Thanks for sharing. Dear listener, we are almost at the end of the episode. Only the last story, which is our special story of today, is left. Before we start the last story, I request you to please let us know if you're enjoying our stories. Also, let us know if you don't like our stories and what type of stories you really want. We truly want to hear from you, as our team is working hard to collect stories. And if you have any paranormal story or anything that's not normal, just comment below. Our team will contact you. Let's start the last story.
Hey, where are you going? Are you feeling scared? We'll make you feel even scarier. Stay with the Midnight Alarm.
My name is Ethan Carter, and I live in a small town in Willow Creek, Oregon. I'm currently a sophomore in college. Since 2012, I've been fascinated by paranormal stories and have been a regular listener of a popular supernatural podcast. Due to my busy schedule, I couldn't visit the studio to share my story, but I hope you'll share it. Without further ado, let me dive straight into the incident. Today's story is a bit long, but I promise not a single second will bore you. The year was 2017. During a summer break, I went to visit my uncle's house in a remote part of Montana. After 8 p.m., the entire area would become eerily silent. One day, my cousin Liam and I decided to go fishing in the lake at night, as we had heard that more fish could be caught after dark. Liam is my cousin, but we're more like best friends. So, we grabbed our fishing gear and headed to the lake, carrying a flashlight. It's worth mentioning that my grandfather was an avid fisherman. He used to go fishing every night in his small rowboat, but that night he was feeling unwell and stayed home to rest. Liam and I took his boat and started fishing. After the first cast, we were catching a lot of fish. Once the cooler was almost full, we placed it a little further away and brought a new one to continue fishing. We were thrilled with the amount of fish we were catching. After a while, I heard a strange motor-like sound coming from the direction of the cooler. It was a full moon night, and the surroundings were clearly visible. There was no sound except for the gentle lapping of water against the boat. When I looked toward the cooler, I saw something resembling a creature with a grotesque, black, dog-like face. It was chewing on the raw fish. As soon as I looked at it, it jumped into the lake. I screamed in fear. Hearing my scream, Liam asked, "What happened?" I said, "What was that near the cooler?" He replied, "I was looking toward the cooler too, but I didn't see anything. Maybe you're imagining things." There was nothing there. Hearing Liam's words, I fell silent, wondering how such a big mistake could happen to me. I had no choice but to console myself, thinking it was my imagination. From that moment, fear started to grow inside me. I told Liam, "Let's not fish anymore tonight. Let's go home and come back tomorrow." Liam insisted on catching more fish, so we continued. After a while, we heard the sound of a child crying from the lakeshore. The cry was so heart-wrenching that it could make anyone's heart break. When I looked around, I realized we had drifted near an old cemetery. The moonlight illuminated the graveyard, which was about an hour and a half away from our home. I was at a loss for what to do. Both of us closed our eyes and started rowing the boat vigorously. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the boat hadn't moved an inch. I was panicking, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, I noticed water was entering the boat. I realized something unnatural was happening. Liam and I jumped out of the boat and ran toward the cemetery. What I saw there left me completely unprepared. We saw a terrifying figure performing some ritual with a young girl sitting in front of him. The man was wearing a dark cloak, with long, matted hair and a necklace of bones around his neck. It was around 2:30 a.m. We understood that he was performing some dark ritual on the girl. The girl was beautiful, and her face, illuminated by the moonlight, showed signs of distress. Liam felt pity for her and said, "I won't let this ritual complete as long as I'm here." I tried to reason with him, saying that staying here could lead to serious consequences, but he didn't listen. Liam went up to the man and asked, "What are you doing here?" Immediately, the child's crying stopped. The man, in a furious state, looked at Liam and started laughing loudly, saying, "I've got you now." We couldn't understand what he meant. Liam asked, "What are you doing with this innocent girl?" The man slapped Liam hard and said, "I won't spare you." Ignoring his words, Liam picked up the girl and ran out of the cemetery. The man laughed menacingly behind us. I also felt pity for the girl. Anyway, our immediate task was to return the girl to her family by morning. After walking for a while, we saw something that left us completely unprepared. The child's arms had grown long and were dangling to the ground. Her eyes were burning like fire, and her entire face had transformed. She was laughing horrifically at us, and a saliva-like substance was dripping from her mouth onto Liam's neck. Seeing this, Liam dropped the girl, and we both ran home. What are you thinking? The story isn't over yet. We are in the middle of it. We decided not to tell anyone at home about the incident, as they would be scared and scold us. When we knocked on the door, my mother opened it and asked, "Why are you both sweating and panting?" "You went fishing, but where are the fish?" To cover up the incident, Liam said, "Nothing happened. We were catching fish, but the cooler fell into the water due to our carelessness, so we came back. We washed up and went to bed. Nothing else happened that night." The next day, Liam's behavior started to change. He became silent, didn't talk to anyone, refused to eat, and behaved rudely with everyone. When I asked him the reason, he slapped me hard. I was stunned and wondered what was happening. Liam had never behaved like this before. I thought maybe he was still shaken from last night's incident. The day passed like this. That night, around 1 a.m., I woke up and noticed Liam wasn't in bed. The door was open. I thought he might have gone to the bathroom, so I went back to sleep. In the morning, I saw Liam sleeping beside me. The same thing happened the next night. Around 1 a.m., I had a terrifying dream. In the dream, the man told me, "If you want to save your brother, come to the cemetery. Your brother is waiting for you." I woke up in fear and saw that Liam wasn't in bed. I searched the entire house but couldn't find him. I thought of going to the cemetery but was too scared. I considered asking my grandfather to accompany me, but since he was unwell and sleeping, I didn't disturb him. At dawn, I saw Liam entering the house. I asked him where he had gone, but he didn't answer. Instead, he said, "If you care about me, go back to sleep." I didn't ask further, but I was scared inside. Seeing Liam's condition, everyone in the house was angry with him. On the third day, I decided not to sleep to see where Liam went at night. Around 1 a.m., I saw Liam getting up, opening the door, and leaving. I followed him secretly. I realized he was heading toward the cemetery. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I thought of stopping him, but I was too scared to go forward. Soon, I saw Liam entering the cemetery. It was a moonless night, and there was no light anywhere. I had a flashlight with me, and Liam was walking in the dark. When I entered the cemetery, I was completely unprepared for what I saw. Liam sat in front of the same terrifying figure, who was chanting over a fire, using human skulls and bones. The man was blowing something onto Liam. After a while, the man said, "Now it's done." I stood there, tears streaming down my face, watching my cousin being subjected to something dark. I couldn't do anything. Unless you experience it yourself, you can't understand how painful it is. Anyway, back to the story. I saw Liam leaving the cemetery and heading toward the graveyard. He was carrying a large shovel. I tried to stop him in many ways, but he didn't listen. I saw him digging up graves, pulling out bones and skulls, and taking them to the man. The stench was unbearable. I couldn't take it anymore and ran home. I told everyone at home everything that had happened. At dawn, Liam returned home. Everyone saw him coming back. Liam's mother broke down in tears and cried, "What has happened to you, my son?" Liam didn't respond. He just stared blankly. His eyes were sunken, and his face had turned pale. No mother can bear to see her son in such a condition. Early in the morning, we brought a local priest who was skilled in dealing with supernatural phenomena. The priest said, "His condition is very bad. I will do what I can to help." The priest closed his eyes and started praying. When he opened his eyes, he said, "He has been badly affected by something dark. I can't handle the man's power." Saying this, the priest left. The family was in turmoil. We didn't know what to do. That day passed in despair. No one could eat anything. That night, I was too scared to sleep with Liam, so I slept in another room. Around 1 a.m., I heard Liam's door open. We all tried to hold him down, but even four of us couldn't restrain him. He had become incredibly strong. We had no choice but to chain him up. Liam was screaming loudly, trying to break free, and throwing whatever he could find at us. Seeing her son in such a state was heartbreaking for my Aunt Liam's mother. She cried until she fainted. The next day, we found a local occult expert. Without delay, we took Liam, still chained, to the expert. The expert, who was around 40 years old and had experience with dark rituals, listened to our story. Liam's mother pleaded, "Please save my son. If something happens to him, I won't survive," the expert said. "He has been badly affected by something dark. It will be difficult to break its hold, but I will fight with all my strength. Your biggest mistake was going to the cemetery and picking up that girl." The man knew that Liam has a soft spot for children. He needed human bones and skulls for his dark rituals. Since the graveyard is a sacred place, the man couldn't enter it himself. That's why he used Liam to bring the bones and skulls. Once his work was done, he would have killed Liam. "Since you've brought him to me, I will perform a ritual. I will need some ingredients: a black goat, water from 7 springs, ashes from a sacred fire, and the blood of a completely black rooster." Liam's mother asked, "Will my son be okay if we do this?" The expert replied, "I can't guarantee, but there's hope for a good outcome." The next day, we gathered the ingredients and brought Liam, still chained, to the expert. He began the ritual. Soon, we noticed the entire room was shaking violently. The expert said, "Don't be afraid. I will now confront the dark force." After a while, Liam's body started trembling, and he spoke in a deep voice, "I have arrived." The expert asked the entity to communicate with the man's dark forces and find a way to save Liam. The entity replied, "The man is very powerful. I can't match his strength." Saying this, the entity left Liam's body. Liam's mother broke down in tears and begged the expert to save her son at any cost. The expert decided to summon one of the man's dark entities. For this, he needed fresh blood from Liam's mother. She cut her hand and gave the blood to the expert, who used it to write something on Liam's forehead. The expert continued chanting, and the fire in the ritual grew taller. Soon, the man's dark entity entered Liam's body. The expert asked, "How can we break the dark hold?" The entity replied, "You must summon all of the man's dark forces and destroy him using them." The expert used all his strength to summon 9 out of the man's 10 dark entities. He failed to summon the last one. Thinking that one entity couldn't do much, the expert sent the 9 entities to destroy the man. They succeeded, and immediately, Liam fainted. Before dying, the man's last entity made a vow, but I don't know what it was. After that, Liam's behavior returned to normal. A few months later, Liam developed a wound on his neck where the girl's saliva had fallen. We consulted many doctors, but the wound wouldn't heal. One night, Liam had a seizure. We all carried him to an ambulance and headed to a good hospital in Portland. As the ambulance left the town around midnight, the driver noticed that the vehicle felt unusually heavy. The speed was around 70 to 80 miles per hour. The driver checked if something was on the roof, but the brakes weren't working, and the speed kept increasing. We heard loud banging sounds on the roof, like someone was hitting it with a hammer. We realized something unnatural was happening. After a while, everything calmed down, and we reached the hospital. The doctors declared Liam dead. Perhaps this was the fulfillment of the vow made by the man's last entity. No one could accept the unnatural death of such a young man. His mother turned to stone and is now undergoing treatment for mental illness. This incident still haunts me deeply. I often see Liam in my dreams, and when I remember the past, I can't hold back my tears. Please pray for my cousin to rest in peace and for his mother to recover soon. That was a very nice story. I hope all my listeners enjoyed it. Also, comment below which story from today you liked the most. It's time to leave now. Thanks for staying with the Midnight Alarm.